Miles Davis was 44 years old, playing jazz at a rock festival, to the most hostile crowd he'd ever faced. They threw bottles at the stage, they screamed at him to leave. One person in the front row yelled, "Go back to the museum, old man." 10 minutes later, 600,000 people were on their feet, crying. Some of them called it the greatest performance they'd ever witnessed. August 29, 1970. Isle of Wight, a small island off the southern coast of England. The location was remote, the weather was unpredictable, but none of that mattered because something historic was happening. The Isle of Wight festival had drawn 600,000 people, making it the largest music gathering in history at that time. It was bigger than Woodstock, bigger than Monterey, bigger than anything the world had ever seen. This was rock and roll's golden age, electric guitars screaming through Marshall amps, drum solos that made your chest vibrate, vocals that could shatter glass. The lineup read like a who's who of rock royalty: Jimi Hendrix, The Who, The Doors, Joni Mitchell, Leonard Cohen, Sly and the Family Stone. 5 days of pure rock energy, and the crowd had come prepared to lose their minds. Then someone at the festival headquarters looked at the schedule and noticed something that made them nervous. Sandwiched between The Who and Jimi Hendrix was a name that didn't quite fit: Miles Davis, a jazz musician, a 44-year-old jazz musician with a trumpet, playing to 600,000 rock fans who wanted electric guitars and primal screams. The organizers approached Miles's manager. "Maybe we could move him to a later time slot," they suggested carefully. "You know, when the crowd thins out a bit, when people are more mellow." The answer came back swift and absolute: no. Miles wanted prime time. Miles wanted the crowd at its biggest, its loudest, its most rock and roll. And Miles Davis always got what he wanted. But here's what made this particularly dangerous. Miles wasn't coming to play traditional jazz. He wasn't bringing the smooth, sophisticated sound that made Kinda Blue the best-selling jazz album of all time. No, Miles was bringing something different, something controversial, something that had already made half the jazz world hate him. He was bringing fusion. In 1970, Miles Davis was in the middle of a radical transformation. The man who had defined cool jazz in the 1950s, who had created modal jazz in the late 50s, who had been the epitome of sophisticated restraint, had gone electric. His new album, Bitches Brew, had just been released, and jazz purists were calling it a betrayal. "He's killed jazz," they said. "He's sold out to rock." Miles didn't care what they thought. "Music is changing," he told anyone who would listen. "I'm changing with it. I'm not old enough to be in a museum yet." His band reflected this new direction. Gone were the traditional jazz quartet arrangements. In their place, electric piano, electric bass, electric guitar. His drummer, Jack DeJohnette, was playing with the power of a rock drummer. On keyboards were two future legends, Chick Corea and Keith Jarrett. On guitar was John McLaughlin, a British musician who could make his instrument scream like Hendrix, but with jazz sophistication. The sound they created was aggressive, dense, chaotic. It was jazz that hit you in the chest like rock and roll. This was the band Miles was bringing to Isle of Wight, to a crowd that had never heard of fusion, to a crowd that wasn't even sure they liked jazz. When Miles and his band arrived at the festival grounds, the atmosphere backstage was tense. Rock musicians looked at them with confusion, some with barely concealed contempt. One guitarist, whose band had played earlier that day, muttered loud enough for everyone to hear, "Jazz? Here? What's next? A symphony orchestra?" Miles heard him. Everyone knew he heard him. But Miles Davis didn't explain himself to anyone. He just adjusted his dark sunglasses, checked his trumpet, and waited for his time slot. The organizers made one last attempt. "Mr. Davis, we could put you on later tonight, after midnight. The crowd might be more receptive then." Miles looked at them through those impenetrable sunglasses. "What time is Hendrix playing?" "Tomorrow evening. Prime time." "Then I want today's prime time. 7:30. It was 7:25 when Miles Davis walked to the side of the stage. The Who had just finished their set, and the crowd was still buzzing with that particular energy that comes from watching guitar-smashing rock gods. The sun hadn't set yet. The crowd was massive, visible as far as the eye could see, a sea of humanity that stretched back beyond the horizon. The announcement came over the PA system. "Ladies and gentlemen, Miles Davis." There was a moment of confused silence. Then murmuring rippled through the crowd. "Who? Did they say jazz? What the hell?" Miles walked onto that stage like a man walking to his execution, but with the confidence of someone who knew something the executioners didn't. He was 44 years old, wearing a velvet jacket, despite the August heat, his signature dark sunglasses hiding his eyes. Behind him, his band took their positions. Electric instruments everywhere, but clearly not a rock band. The booing started in the front rows, just a few people at first, then spreading like wildfire through the crowd. "Boo! Get off! We want rock!" Within 30 seconds, thousands of voices had joined in. The sound was deafening. Miles didn't go near the microphone, didn't try to introduce himself or his band, didn't attempt to win the crowd over with charm or explanation. Instead, he did what he'd become famous for doing. He turned his back to the audience. That iconic Miles Davis move, dismissive, arrogant, powerful. He turned to face his band, caught their eyes and nodded, and they started to play. The first minute was brutal. The music that came out was nothing like what the crowd expected or wanted. It was slow, but not in a pretty way. It was complex, but not in a show-off way. It was atmospheric, dark, full of space and tension. The guitar had distortion, but it wasn't playing rock riffs. The drums had power, but they weren't keeping a steady rock beat. This was something else entirely. The booing got louder. "This is boring," someone shouted. "Where's the melody?" Then the bottles started flying. Security guards near the stage tensed up, ready to intervene. Backstage, the organizers were panicking. "Should we pull him? We can't let this turn into a riot." But Miles kept playing. Eyes closed, trumpet to his lips, back still turned to 600,000 hostile people. The music continued, strange and hypnotic and completely uncompromising. Someone in the front row stood up. A young guy, probably in his early 20s, his face red with anger or maybe too much beer or both. He cupped his hands around his mouth and yelled at the top of his lungs, "Go back to the museum, old man." The insult cut through the noise. People nearby heard it and laughed. Some picked it up. "Museum, museum, old man." Miles heard it. Everyone knew he heard it. His shoulders stiffened slightly, the only indication that the words had landed. But he didn't turn around, didn't respond, just kept playing. That trumpet pressed to his lips, pulling out notes that sounded like he was arguing with the universe. 3 minutes in, and it looked like the greatest disaster in festival history. A legendary jazz musician being run off stage by a rock crowd that wanted nothing to do with him. But then something happened in minute 4. John McLaughlin's guitar suddenly screamed. Not rock and roll screaming, but something wilder, stranger, more primal. Chick Corea hit a chord on his electric piano that seemed to split the air. The drums kicked up, faster now, harder, approaching something that felt like funk, but wasn't quite. And Miles lifted his trumpet and played a single note. One long, sustained, pain-filled note that seemed to contain every emotion a human being could feel. In the front section of that massive crowd, a few people stopped talking. They felt something they couldn't quite name, but it made them pay attention. Miles played a second note, then a third. Not a melody in any traditional sense. More like a conversation. More like his trumpet was speaking directly to something deep inside each listener, bypassing their brains and going straight to their guts. By the 5th minute, the booing had decreased. By the 7th minute, it had almost stopped. Because people were starting to realize something. This music was attacking them. It was aggressive, angry, chaotic, but it was also beautiful in a way that rock and roll rarely achieved. It had the power of rock, but it had depth that went beyond power. It had fury, but it was controlled fury. It was art hitting them in the face. Miles was still playing with his back turned, but now it felt different. Now it felt like a statement. "I don't need your approval. I don't need you to understand. This is art, and art doesn't beg." The music built, the guitar wailed, the drums pounded into chests. Miles's trumpet became a battle cry, a sermon, a prophecy all at once, and people started to really listen. Not just hear, but listen. The 8th minute was when the magic happened. From somewhere in the middle of that 600,000-person crowd, a voice rang out. Not booing this time, but shouting in exhilaration. "Yeah, yeah, Miles." Then another voice, then a group, then an entire section. By the 10th minute, barely 10 minutes after they'd started, 600,000 people were on their feet. Not sitting with arms crossed, not booing, standing, clapping, jumping, arms in the air, completely transformed. Miles was still playing, still had his back turned, but for a different reason now. Not from disrespect, but from power. The statement had shifted. "See, I can do this without needing you to like me, but now you like me anyway." The band could feel the energy shift. Chick Corea later said it was like a physical wave that hit the stage. Suddenly the air changed, he recalled. It went from hostile to hungry. They wanted more, and Miles gave them more. The performance stretched from 10 minutes to 20, then to 30, then to 45. Each moment built on the last. The music became more intense, more wild, more free. Miles's trumpet sang and screamed and whispered and roared. When they finally reached the end, when that last note echoed across the massive field and faded into the evening air, the roar from the crowd was deafening. People were crying, actually crying. Some had fallen to their knees. Others were hugging strangers. Miles Davis slowly walked to the microphone, the first time he'd approached it all night. The crowd fell silent, desperate to hear what he would say. This man who had just transformed them, who had taken them from hatred to love in the space of a few notes. He leaned into the microphone and said 2 words, "Thank you." Then he turned and walked off the stage. The applause and cheering lasted for 15 minutes. Miles was already in his dressing room, probably already thinking about something else entirely. Backstage was chaos. Musicians who had watched from the wings were stunned. Jimi Hendrix found Miles and could barely speak. Man, he couldn't finish the sentence. He just embraced him. Pete Townshend from The Who approached, shaking his head in disbelief. "You just taught us how to play rock and roll," he said, "and you weren't even playing rock and roll." The festival organizers who had wanted to move his time slot came to apologize. "Mr. Davis, if we had known," Miles just smiled, a rare expression from him. "You did know. I knew too. Does it matter now?" The next morning, British newspapers ran headlines that no one had expected. Jazz invades rock and wins. Miles Davis conquers 600,000 in 10 minutes. The performance that changed everything. Music critics who had been at the festival struggled to describe what they'd witnessed. Miles Davis didn't just play music, one wrote. He conducted a mass conversion. He took 600,000 rock fans and showed them that the boundaries between genres are illusions, that great music is just great music. People who were in that crowd talked about it for decades afterward. Many admitted, years later, that they had been among the booers. "I was there," they'd say, often with shame in their voices. "I booed him. I yelled for him to get off. Then 10 minutes later I was crying and applauding. It was the most humbling moment of my life. He showed me what I didn't know I needed to hear." For Miles, the Isle of Wight festival became a turning point. Though perhaps not in the way people expected. He didn't suddenly become more accommodating to audiences. He didn't start pandering to rock crowds. If anything, he became even more uncompromising, because he had proven something to himself. He didn't need anyone's permission to be great. In interviews afterward, when journalists brought up that "go back to the museum, old man" insult, Miles would smile that enigmatic smile. "The museum," he'd say. "I'm not going to the museum, I'm building it. We're just going to buy tickets to see what I put inside." The Isle of Wight performance became legendary. Bootleg recordings of it became some of the most treasured items among jazz and rock collectors alike. Not just because of the music, though the music was extraordinary, but because of what it represented. The moment when one man, armed with nothing but his talent and his absolute refusal to compromise, transformed hostility into reverence. 600,000 people booed him. 10 minutes later, those same 600,000 people were giving him a standing ovation, many with tears streaming down their faces. What changed? The music was the same from note 1 to note 45. Miles was exactly the same person when he walked off as when he walked on. The only thing that changed was that people decided to listen, really listen. And once they did, they couldn't help but be transformed. Sometimes the greatest victories don't come from making people like you. They come from being so undeniably yourself, so completely committed to your truth, that people have no choice but to respect it. Miles Davis proved that on August 29, 1970, on the biggest stage in the world, in front of the most hostile audience imaginable, he didn't win by being nice. He didn't win by compromising. He won by turning his back to 600,000 people and playing the music only he could play. And in doing so, he reminded everyone watching that real art doesn't ask permission. Real art doesn't beg for approval. Real art simply exists and dares you to ignore it. No one at Isle of Wight could ignore Miles Davis that night. And music has never been quite the same since.